now more than ever, people need to go within and plug into that cellular memory, plug into divine source, detach as much as possible from the matrix. A lot of these people that have all these abilities, who have celestial star ancestry, they're operating not only throughout this cosmos, but in higher planes, and they're working against the Draco Empire. The photonic energy and the cosmic rays will activate our higher centers. And it's incumbent upon us to ride that frequency wave. Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you are listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, our very special guest is Richard Smith. Richard Smith is a veteran UFO researcher, and he was a colleague of mine in the original NSPN, Night Search Paranormal Network, one of the very early paranormal podcast shows, which are quite common now. But Richard Smith and I, and a few others, were one of the pioneers, actually, in the whole paranormal podcast network scheme of things. And it's quite a pleasure for me to reconnect with Richard after all these years and talk about a very, very important topic. Richard Smith is a professional life-changing speaker and motivational experiencer, web design consultant, and visionary author on the topic of extraterrestrial contact, the Moorish legacy, human origins, and related matters. Smith received high honors at New York State University for his dedicated work with extraterrestrial intervention and alien contact phenomena. Richard has published 2 books and authored 2 books, The Moor, the Mason, and the Alien, A Call to Action, and he's also written Legions of Light, Armies of Darkness. Smith is committed to raising conscious awareness in our health and well-being as caretakers of the planet, as well as creating a better understanding of our place in the cosmos, both physically and spiritually. He believes that we must focus on the lost knowledge of where we come from before we can truly understand the ancient wisdom of where we are going on the path of our everyday lives. He carries a dedicated special interest in making the Human Origins Global Conference Tour an international success in all regions of the global community for future generations, while empowering people to realize how important they truly are in this grandest of all adventures known as life. Globally recognized for spearheading the Human Origins Revolution, he currently resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico, working on his 3rd book, and has been speaking worldwide with author events, interviews, lectures, and conferences. Richard's websites are ufoteacher.com, and for the UFO Teacher Global Initiative, it is initiative.ufoteacher.com, and for the Human Origins Global Conference Tour, it's humanoriginsconference.com, and we will have all the links for Richard's sites, as well as all the links in order to purchase his books on the Cosmic Switchboard website. So without any further ado, Richard Smith, how are you?
Doing great there, James, and thank you for having me on the show. This is a great honor. It's awesome to reconnect with you after all these years. Fantastic.
That's right. We did some great work with the Night Search Paranormal Network. We were pioneers in our field, really we were. We had Eve Lorgan was on the team,
yes.
Yourself, Eddie Middleton. We had a great show.
I remember,
and each one of
Janet Russell was on there too. I remember.
Janet Russell was on there. Janet Russell did a lot of great work in the East Coast. She was one of the early pioneers. She had her own, if memory serves, cable access television show, where she had a number of my colleagues on as guests. So we had a lot of the early pioneers, and we're one of the early pioneers. Not many people realize this in the podcasting genre. And Richard, in your own right, you've done a lot of UFO research, and you've had experiences yourself. You want to tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I often tell people, that the way I started off was many years ago. I mean, I'm going to be 46 this year, just to put it into perspective. But this started for me when I had turned 21. So we're talking 25 years now. At that time, just turning 21, I had a powerful extraterrestrial experience, a very powerful awakening that brought a lot of things to my attention that had been going on with my family, and specifically my brother, my mother, my grandmother, which gets into the whole generational thing there. And that for me personally, I've had extraterrestrial contact experiences since like the age of 4 years old. But it wasn't until the age of 21 that all that stuff flooded back to me in a total recall. And it was right at that point that a certain extraterrestrial being that I refer to in my book as the crone, which is very much like a female praying mantis type, is the one that started that visitation with me, that open dialogue that I refer to as the quote-unquote conversation. And that started off right at the time that I was getting ready to go into my second 4 years of college for my bachelor's degree at the State University of New York, Old Westbury campus. And I was asked at that point in that experience, would you use your talents and skills to basically educate people on what's going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I said, sure, let's go for it. And that's how it started off for me with the artwork, which people can see on my website. And then eventually it evolved into doing lecture presentations. And then that evolved into the first book, Legions of Light, Armies of Darkness, which was officially published through Author House in 2005. And over the years, I kept on doing the seminars and conferences and presentations, and then finally the opportunity came up to dive back into the writing, which was intended all along because everybody kept asking me, where's the next book, And so from January of 2014, I was on a mission at that point, and I started writing nonstop right on through to July 2015 last year, finished the second book, the new one that's out now, The More, the Mason, and the Alien, and got it officially published in September of last year. So it's been out for about a year now, and has met with a lot of wonderful and amazing feedback. Interesting how people have come out of the woodwork left and right once I published that book. They read about what I was talking about in there. And then as more and more people started catching on to the book, over the past year, it's been a myriad of interviews left and right. And what that did was it created an opportunity to also intermingle and mix in a dialogue about the other project that I've been involved with directly since about 2012, which is the John Ford Initiative. Because people started asking, once they started getting to know me better and looking at the website and so forth, they're like, what's this thing you're always promoting on there, the John Ford Initiative? What's going on with this guy? And aside from, talking about myself and talking about the book and doing the interviews on the new book and so forth, there also came up the opportunity to start splicing that into the dialogue, too, about what happened to this ufological researcher named John Ford, who was the director, and still is the director, of what is known as the Long Island UFO Network. So, these two kind of things kind of crossed over with each other in a big way once I got the book published, which is a good thing, because 2012, okay, I got a phone call out of the blue from a researcher who, excuse me, I'm having a brain fart. His name escapes me now, but he is someone that I had known years ago when I used to live in New York, and I've been living in Albuquerque, New Mexico for the past 8 years, but most of my life I lived in New York. So I get this phone call, and it's from someone who it was kind of like a blast from the past. It turns out this person had been watching my progression with the things I was doing, the seminars, the lectures, interviews in the media, the radio show I was running myself at the time. And they had felt that I had gotten to the point where they wanted to talk to me about something I hadn't even thought of since 1996, which was the John Ford issue. And so this person asks me, he says, Rick, he says, I've been watching you all these years and how you've evolved and where you're at and getting yourself established. He says, I wanted to ask you, he says, do you remember John Ford? And I almost fell on the floor because it is a name I hadn't heard about in quite a long time. And I said, yeah. I said, and being naive about it, I said, how, and it feels stupid to say it now, but at the time, that conversation in 2012, I said, how's he doing? Because you don't think of someone being stuck in the dilemma that he got stuck in for 20 years. And this researcher said to me, well, he says, that's what I'm calling you about. He says, he's still locked away. And my jaw hit the floor because I couldn't believe, and I started calculating the years. I was like, wait a minute. And at that time, we're talking 2012 being 4 years ago. I was like, wait, 16 years? He goes, yeah, we're going on 17 now. And I almost had, at that point, I said, tell me more. And he started explaining the situation to me. Okay? And at that point, I almost had tears running down my face because it just hit me that hard that being at, essentially ground zero, Long Island, in 1996 when all that went down, and then knowing that this guy has been completely forgotten about and locked away for what is now, this year marks the 20th anniversary of him being illegally and illegitimately arrested, incarcerated, and framed for a crime he never committed, and locked away in an institution that was designed to make people forget about him and let him rot for 20 years. That wouldn't be an understatement either, because he is pretty close to rotting away at this point. When we get into the details of what's happened to him in there for the past 20 years with his health issues and so forth, you're going to be shocked yourself. At that point, I was asked, once again, like the experience I had at the age of 21, here where I was in 2012 being asked again, would you use your talents and skills for John Ford? And I said, okay, give me a week to research this. Let me think about it. And a week later, I came back at him and said, okay, I'll do it. And I realized what was taking place in the 90s is something that didn't exist in the year 2012. And after doing the research, I realized there was a valiant group of people, the Free John Ford Committee, that existed in the late 90s, and they tried their damnedest. They were led by Elaine Douglas, a ufologist who had been a state director for MUFON at the time. And because of her valiant efforts to defend John Ford and try and rally support, MUFON turned on her like a pack of pit bulls and wolves and verbally tore her to pieces and pushed her out of MUFON in a political maneuver that was so damn disgusting that at that point it made everybody realize that MUFON is a heinous organization that will not ever do the right thing. And they hide behind the excuse of, we're just here for the science. Excuse me, but if it wasn't for civil rights, there'd be no such thing as science. And as far as science goes, let me point out the fact that as late as the 1960s, the medical industry had this asinine notion that it was forbidden to do heart surgery because that was going against God. Okay? So if you're hiding behind the idea that we're just here for the science, then let me point out some examples of complete and total ignorance on where science was completely wrong. And it took a young black doctor at Hoskins University to point the way and say it is not evil to operate on the heart for adults and children. So, heart surgery only existed from about the 1960s on in the United States. So that's just an example of how stupid and asinine MUFON's being when they try to hide behind science as an excuse to avoid the politics, when in fact science and politics have been in bed with each other for quite a long time. And so that political mentality was used to turn their backs and avoid the responsibility that they had to back Elaine Douglas in the 90s to go after this issue. They had the political clout to do it, and they wouldn't. And they just wanted to let him rot away. And that is heinously disgusting, which is the reason why a lot of people have turned away from MUFON over the years since then. And people are turning away from MUFON today because when they learn about the truth of what happened with the John Ford affair and how MUFON stood at the precipice of turning the tide against the system and saving John Ford's life, that's been a sticking point that MUFON has never been willing to apologize for. But that was the group that started it, the Committee to Free John Ford. And I mentioned before, from the late 90s to the year 2012, what was the difference? The difference was that there was no such thing as an internet. So when this ufological researcher came to me, George Dixon, thank goodness the brain fart went away. That was his name, George Dixon. Okay, he finally came to me. When George Dixon first approached me in 2012, that's what he saw in me. Because I had developed one hell of a social media arsenal, and he saw that. And that's why it only took me a week to research it and come back to him and say, okay, I'll do it, because I knew this was the one key element that didn't exist in the 1990s. So at that point, I put together the official website for the John Ford Initiative, and I decided we're going to call it the John Ford Initiative, okay? And we're going to get rid of all these crappy images that people have been putting out there that makes him look like, this ugly mug shot, like he's a damn child molester or something. No. And I went back to one of his original longtime friends, Joe Zappardo, who's also been involved with this from the beginning. And I said, does anybody have an intelligent-looking picture of this guy? I'm sick and tired of looking at all these bullshit photos. So finally, Joe Zappardo dug up one from the mid-'90s, and that's the one I've been using on the website. And the website is John Ford Initiative at UFOteacher.com. And that's the website people can visit as the official web address for the John Ford Initiative there. I kicked that off in 2012. And there's an interesting story as to how things developed. Actually, let me correct myself. It's just johnford.ufoteacher.com. That's the proper address. And as the months followed from February of 2012 on, and I started going after this more and more, reports started coming back to me that I had suddenly gotten the interest of Suffolk County, New York, which is where all this went down, from the corrupt politics. And believe me, it's well known throughout the entire United States that Suffolk County, New York is the most corrupt county in the whole damn country. Their politics, their police force, forget it. I mean, it's just plain old scumbag central over there, left and right. And which is why during the time of the 90s, at the time that George Pataki was governor of New York State, the threat had come down from Albany, the capital of New York State, that they were going to move in and take over both Nassau and Suffolk County because things had gotten so bad. And that's the only reason why they cleaned up their act a little bit, just to get Albany off their back. That also took place in the 90s around this pig swill of garbage that was framing John Ford. And we'll get into what actually went down with John Ford and why this happened, because that's a phenomenal story unto itself as well.
Before you get into that part, I think it would be beneficial to the listeners to know the background. First of all, MUFON stands for Mutual UFO Network, and they're the biggest, allegedly, civilian private UFO organization in the world, but they've been nothing but trouble for real researchers for many years. They've been nothing but trouble as far as getting the Bentwater story out. They've harassed Larry Warren and others. They've had some good researchers over the years, like like Leonard Stringfield and Bill Hamilton, but in general, the institution of MUFON has been a stumbling block for real UFO research. Also, all of this came about because of, I'm talking about the harassment, incarceration, and John Ford winding up a political prisoner,
right,
because of the two key cases that he investigated, amongst many others. The first was the UFO crash at Mauritius Bay, September 24th, 1989, and then after that, the UFO crash at South Haven Park, Long Island, November 24th, 1992. Now, do you want to talk first about Mauritius Bay and then talk about South Haven Park to give the listeners an idea of just what John Ford was sinking his teeth into and why he became public enemy number one over there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We can talk about that, too. Well, in '89, when the Mauritius Bay UFO crash went down, it was calls were already coming in about it, and people started, at that time, quietly, because you're talking 1989 now, and quietly coming out of the woodwork and wanting to talk to someone who was a researcher about their experiences privately, okay, anonymously. John Ford was one of those people. And what happened was that when he started putting the pieces together between the experiences that people were having from the Mauritius Bay crash in '89, and later on in 1992, the South Haven Park crash, which is where a lot more of the political stuff started erupting, okay, there were similarities between the two with the experiences people were reporting back, what they saw going on with certain clandestine elements like black helicopters and black, at the time, black Jeeps, or nowadays we call them SUVs, but showing up out of nowhere. And John Ford started going after this with his ufological researcher team in LUFON, Long Island UFO Network. And, in fact, it was the early 90s, it was the late 80s into the early 90s when they actually started cutting their teeth, so to speak, on this stuff and going after this headlong. Well, he promised these people anonymity. Well, just to give you a backdrop here of the friction that developed, MUFON comes along and shows an interest in this. John Ford's great. Yeah, he's like, great, let's work together on this. And he was friendly about it, you know. Well, MUFON turned around and said, well, we want all of your records. Give them over to us so we can look at it. And it was in a very obstinate, obtuse, and belligerent manner. And John Ford was like, wait a minute. My organization, LUFON, has promised these people anonymity. I can't hand these records over to you. Okay? Now, there were some that gave him permission, but not everyone. Okay? And they were miffed over the fact that he wouldn't hand over all the records to those who wanted to remain anonymous and didn't want MUFON knowing about this stuff because they had already put their trust in LUFON with John Ford. So this was the beginning of understanding the hatred that was rolling downhill from, the great white ivory tower of MUFON down to little old LUFON on Long Island, okay? And so, all of a sudden now MUFON was acting like Big Brother. And LUFON was defending their own witnesses, and rightly so, because John Ford made that promise to them. He says, I won't give up your anonymity. MUFON didn't want to hear it. So at that point, words were shared back and forth, which, you can imagine how that conversation went. And that pretty much severed the relationship between MUFON and LUFON at that point. And MUFON was out for blood at that point and basically blacklisted LUFON, specifically John Ford. Okay. Well, 1992 comes along. Here comes the reports now that were erupting in the years that followed from 92 to 94 on the South Haven Park UFO crash. And So people were coming out of the woodwork left and right on that, firefighters, anybody, It was a lot of different people, a lot of cross-section there in society in Long Island. Once again, MUFON was on the scene. One of my own mentors and friend, Brian Levins, was one of the lead investigators at the time when a lot of that was going down. And so, he was right there, right along others like Joe Zappardo and Peter Moon, who researched the Montauk Project of Long Island. They were all friends with John Ford, and so it was happening. I was more so on the peripheral at the time in the 90s, doing my own thing with what I was doing at the time. But I had become a member of LUFON at the time there and was trying to stay up on what was going down at that point. The ramifications that came out of the South Haven Park crash was this. First of all, you had eyewitnesses coming home from work, 5, 6 p.m., okay, on Sunrise Highway. And Sunrise Highway runs east and west for the better part of the length of Long Island, okay? And you just picture, like, Long Island is basically, as Walt Whitman would say, the shape of a fish, okay? And so it's about 200 miles long from Manhattan to Montauk. Well, South Haven Park, being in Suffolk County, is just north of Sunrise Highway. And what eyewitnesses saw that night in 1982 was the way it was described, you would have to think it was a ship that was kind of somewhat disabled or having trouble operating itself. But it was described as a cigar-shaped craft that was kind of wobbling and trying to stay stable in the sky, but wobbling, kind of like in jointy movements as if it was trying to correct itself. And slowly but surely went down from the south side of Sunrise Highway, over Sunrise Highway to the north side, and went down right in where it's expected to have crashed right in that part of South Haven Park there. And eyewitnesses said that they saw the sky light up at that point where they suspected it going down and crashing. Not within what had to have been no more than a span of time of like 15 minutes, you had black government jeeps and black helicopters showing up everywhere, up and down all the exits involved with Sunrise Highway and all the subordinate exits of the side roads coming off of Sunrise Highway, blocking people off, cordoning people off, detouring them in different directions. It was a damn mess that night with rush hour traffic, people coming home from work. But the point is, even in rush hour traffic, where the hell did these guys come from in such a short and immediate period of time? It implies that there was more going on with this cigar-shaped UFO than met the eye. That maybe it was a joint experiment between something that could have been extraterrestrial and something that could have been government or black ops, maybe like a test subject. Well, here's where everything goes to hell as far as escalating way out of control. John Ford jumps on it. So does LUFON. He starts going after it, looking for people to interview. People start talking to him. Others don't like the fact that he's pushing this issue with the UFO sighting and suspected UFO crash in South Haven Park. And the opponents were all Suffolk County Republican Party officials who had everything to lose by having John Ford push the UFO issue and expose it. Why? Well, one, it was the early 90s when people were still being chased down in the streets and tarred and feathered and skinned alive for talking about this stuff. And two, it was the first time ever in the history of ufology where you have two calamities running into each other, two highly volatile issues slamming right into each other that had never happened before. One was the UFO crash, obviously. The other was the issue hiding behind the scenes that Suffolk County politicians were shaking in their bootstraps about, and that was the environmental issue of illegal toxic dumping in the same exact spot where the UFO crashed. Well, now you got a double whammy. John Ford suspected the political arena of toxic dumping, but never in anyone's wildest imagination could they have figured that they had just walked right into this hornet's nest of a UFO crash and illegal toxic dumping slamming into each other at the same time. And so this is ultimately what put John Ford on the supreme blacklist for political and public humiliation and professional assassination, so to speak. And at that point, he started being harassed illegally by Suffolk County police, who were put to the task by the Suffolk County politicians to, quote-unquote, get rid of this guy, because they didn't know what he knew. Now, mind you, LUFON is, like any organization, it is a corporation unto itself. It has its own paperwork. It has its own research files, having nothing to do with John Ford personally. Okay, so, but guess where the files were being held? Right in John Ford's house, in his business, in his office. Okay, he had a separate office section for these, company files for LUFON, locked up in file cabinets securely. The thing is, what was causing them to hit the panic button was they didn't know how much he knew. How much did he know about the toxic dumping versus how much did he know about the UFO crash versus how much did he know about both of them together? And what was he going to go public with? Okay, because the more they kept harassing him, the more he would turn around and say, to hell with you. If you don't get off my back, I'm gonna start going straight to the media and telling them what you're doing to me. Well, that only put them into a panic even more, because okay, what the hell is he going to talk about? What does he have in the company files for LUFON? So this is what sparked and hatched the sting operation to blackmail him and frame him for a crime he never committed. And that sting operation resulted in, you have to understand, John Ford, very friendly person, very community-oriented. He had a number of dogs that he took care of. And yes, he had a legally licensed gun collection. He had the proper paperwork for every last gun that he had. All right? So, yeah, he had a gun collection too. So what? Who doesn't? All right? So this is where they went after him. They went after him in his own home. And what they did was, whoever was watching him was obviously canvassing the whole situation and putting together a very detailed and diabolical plot to screw him over. And what they did was they saw that he had befriended someone by the name of a very questionable character as far as I'm concerned, but someone by the name of Joe Mazzucchelli, who is infamously known with the John Ford case because no one was ever quite sure which side of the playing tracks he came from, whether he was genuinely someone who was down on his luck and had a criminal record and was trying to get his life back together, or someone who was working as an operative as part of the sting. But this guy got to be, he showed an interest in LUFON, he showed an interest in the UFO issue, and John Ford took him under his wing as his friend and started, showing him the ropes with LUFON and what to do and how to approach a UFO investigation and all that. Well, they want, one of the common things that any ufological researcher will do is they will go and utilize a very, very, very low radioactive substance, radium, okay? And, radium doesn't even come close to, let's say, uranium or plutonium, okay? Doesn't even come close to it, not even in the same category as far as radioactive material goes. Because if you were exposed to radium every day of the week, it would take 20 years for the damn thing to have any effect on you, if it was going to have an adverse effect at all. And this low-level radioactive material is used commonly in the UFO community by any ufologist. MUFON knows this too, okay, just to put it in perspective. And they'll use this to test their Geiger counters so that they can go out to a place like, guess what, South Haven Park, and use those Geiger counters to test the area for any residual radioactivity from a crashed UFO. Okay? This is commonplace.
Yeah, and I just want to make a quick point that, 2 points, that what MUFON did in turning against John Ford and also trying to obtain all the personal information about his anonymous witnesses is not an isolated case. You probably remember when John Carpenter, who was director of MUFON's alien abduction research, went on this crusade to get all of these alien abductees to come forward and provide personal data to him. He then turns around and gives all that information to Robert Bigelow, who is a known CIA asset, and Robert Bigelow finances NIDS, National Institute of Discovery Sciences, another CIA asset.
Yeah.
And so another thing about the radium is that it's in Federal Firefighters Manual. There's a chapter in there about crashed UFOs and the dangers, the radiological dangers, the electromagnetic dangers that firefighters are likely to encounter in the event of having to deal with a crashed, unidentified flying object. And we know from previous cases, Richard, Roswell, the Kecksburg crash, and December 9th, 1965, that firefighters oftentimes are the first ones on the scene.
Right.
So no surprise that the Federal Firefighters Manual would have a chapter about crashed flying saucers. But please continue about the radium and the Geiger counter. And the one last thing also is that in the days and weeks after the South Haven Park, there was a continuous phase of electromagnetic interference. There were brownouts in the area. There were blackouts in the area. People were still experiencing, weeks after the event, electromagnetic anomalies in and around South Haven Park. Is that correct?
Yes, they were. And there was still there was a whole lot of craziness going on, too. That was, you just look at this whirlpool of paranormal activity taking place on Long Island throughout the 90s. Moriches Bay, East Moriches, South Haven Park crash, Montauk Project shenanigans with UFOs and aliens. You know, it's Plum Island with experimentation on animals, and God forbid you try to get close to Plum Island, they'll blow your ass right out of the water. But so you got to figure, this is an area. And on top of that, the tremendous rise of breast cancer and ovarian cancer for women, which is infamous. I mean, you don't see that anywhere else in the country unless you're living on a Native American reservation and you're poisoned by uranium deposits. But, as far as middle-class America goes, the concentration is Long Island because of, they felt it was attributed to, and I still think it is, the amount of power, the amount of sheer unknown power coming through the telephone lines, the power cords, that once you follow them, there's parts of Long Island where they mysteriously go into the ground to where? Nowhere, okay? So where the hell's all this power going? Underground. And so these are the things that people should pay attention to. And also, just an addendum to what you said before, that book that people can find, I have a copy of it myself right on my bookshelf. I got it by pretending to be a firefighter and calling them up and saying, hey, can I get a copy of this? And I purchased it the very first time that they talked about it on that Sightings episode in the 90s. It's specifically, if you can find it, it's the Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control, 2nd edition. Emphasis on 2nd edition, because that's the only edition published in 1992 that has the infamous Chapter 13, no accident there, Chapter 13, which says, is labeled as Enemy Attack and UFO Potential. Okay? And that's on page 439 of the textbook here. This book is massive. And just to put it into perspective, by the time they got the 3rd edition out, my brother had found out that they took what was Chapter 13 out of the book in the 3rd edition, because William Kramer and Charles Baum, who were the authors of were the authors of the book, they got so much flack and feedback on that infamous Chapter 13 in the 2nd edition that the politics of it forced them to take it out of the book. So that's what happened with that then. Now, I did actually get that 2nd edition there. It's like an infamous collector's item at this point, because you can't find it anywhere else except maybe someone who's probably selling it for some god-awful price on Amazon. You could probably find it there. But no, now, just to put that Chapter 13 in perspective, I had a UFO skeptic in the 90s read that chapter. I said, here, read this. Tell me what you think. And I said if I was going to get an honest answer, it was going to be from a skeptic who didn't want anything to do with it anyway. Well, by the time this woman finished reading Chapter 13, she came back to me with this wild-eyed look on her face, like she was terrified. She says, Rick, she says, I may be a skeptic about this, but she says, this chapter is so phenomenal. She says, anyone who actually believes in this or follows this would instantly throw themselves off the edge of a balcony, because it would put them right over the edge if they were mentally imbalanced. And that I took as, hand-to-God advice from a skeptic who was willing to come over to my side of it and say that. And so I just wanted to put that in there as an anecdotal story as to how even a diehard skeptic would react to that Chapter 13. Because it was phenomenally educational, but like I said, anyone who is, not dealing with a full deck, well, it would put them over the edge. But that, you got to figure all this stuff percolating. That 2nd edition put out in early 90s. Then it goes on to Sightings. John Ford goes after the South Haven UFO Park issue, 1994, after it was already out there for a couple of years and people were now coming out of the woodwork talking about it. Then this collides with the environmental issue of the toxic dumping, which then collides with Suffolk County corrupt politics, looking at John Ford as public enemy number 1. So with the radium, they knew, as in Suffolk County DA, James Catterson, and Suffolk County Republican Party, and Suffolk County Police. That's the they I'm referring to. They knew that the general public was made up of 80% of a bunch of imbeciles who wouldn't know the difference between radium and plutonium if their life depended on it. Okay? So in comes this agent who was working for the Suffolk County Police. He was undercover, and he was brought in. Once again, this is where you get into the gray area. Where the hell does John Mazzucchelli play into all this? Because John Mazzucchelli went to John Ford and said, hey, I got so-and-so who's also interested in coming to one of your meetings and talking with you about UFOs and MUFON. And John, being as friendly as he was, he said, sure, bring him over. I'll be happy to meet him. Well, this other imbecile that John Mazzucchelli brought into the picture turns out to be the undercover agent working for the Suffolk County Police on this sting operation. And he went in with a bug on him, a microphone, okay, to secretly and unknowingly record the conversation. John Ford didn't know this. And this guy was sent in to try and rig and gear the conversation in a very misleading manner. Basically, in that conversation, John's sitting there with Joe Mazzucchelli and this other guy, this Suffolk County informant. They're watching X-Files. John's not thinking of anything of it, and they're joking around about the corrupt politicians with Suffolk County. And as with any of us would do, I mean, I'm the biggest offender at all. You know, they were making jokes about how to get rid of the corrupt politicians of Suffolk County. So, you know, and it was like, hey, you know, let's do this to their toothpaste, or let's do that, and you know, everybody's laughing about it because it was so absurd. And meanwhile, all this is being recorded on a secret mic on the Suffolk County informant, who's sitting right there in the living room with John Ford. And this guy's job was to try and skew the conversation in the direction of making it look like John Ford said, oh, I'm going to assassinate such and such politicians in Suffolk County with radium, or radioactive material in plural, okay, even if they couldn't get him to say the word radium. And so what happened was that same night, when Suffolk County Police were secretly sitting outside of John's home, you know, on the outskirts of the neighborhood, waiting for the high sign to move in for the kill, once they felt that they got enough on that mic that they could manipulate to their favor, then they all moved in. And all of a sudden, Joe Zapardo, who was there, sees this guy walk up with a shotgun pointed at his crotch as if he was going to basically blow his nuts off, and made him back into the house. And they entered the house with a fabricated search warrant. Fabricated in the sense that the date was completely wrong on the search warrant. It was 24 hours off. Now, what the hell judge is going to make that mistake when it comes to something as serious and critical as giving permission for reasonable cause with a search warrant, of which there was no reasonable cause because the Suffolk County Police already had rigged it and already had the search warrant ready. Well, how the hell could you already have the search warrant ready when you didn't even have any kind of a recording on the spy or the agent that was sent into John's home to pretend to be a friend? You know, this is where it all turns into a calamity. And then when you look at the search warrant, you find out it's 24 hours off. Totally wrong date. So it was an illegal search warrant, which in any court of law is thrown out. But somehow, magically, it was accepted in this case. Okay, gee, I have to wonder who was doing the accepting on that one. And they march into his home. They're holding everybody at gunpoint, guns loaded. John has a gun pointed right at his head. And John loved his dogs. Well, they were trying to get him to talk. They were trying to force him to admit to something he never did. And what they did to try and coax him, he never gave in, but they took his beloved dogs, which he took extreme care of. Those were his babies. They took the dogs out back, and they began to pistol whip and beat the shit out of the dogs. The dogs were yelping in pain, and they were forcing him on his knees to listen to the dogs being beaten and abused. And they said, the Suffolk County Police, the cop that was holding the gun to his head, said, "You want that to stop? Admit to what you did." And John's like, "I didn't do anything." And at that point, since they couldn't get him to admit to anything that he didn't do in the first place, the cop at that point says, "You say another word and I'll blow your fucking brains out." And nobody knows what happened to his dogs. They were probably put down, killed off, who knows. But then they proceeded to go even further. The search warrant was not for the corporation known as Lufon. The search warrant was for John Ford's home. Lufon was a separate office in the home, which means it's off limits to the search warrant. They didn't have a search warrant for Lufon. But they entered the office environment illegally and confiscated all of the Lufon research records. They hauled out everything. They didn't leave anything. Took it out in boxes. There was no search warrant for that. To this day, not only is the search warrant invalid, but it was an illegal search warrant that only had to do with John Ford and had nothing to do with the corporation known as Lufon, so they had no right to take the paperwork. Now, granted, you're being held at gunpoint. Who's going to argue at that point? But this is the legal standing of where the whole damn thing falls apart and shows itself to be this overall paranoid agenda to go after him. All of Suffolk County politics, all of Suffolk County law enforcement was out for blood to get rid of him because they didn't know what he knew or didn't know about both the UFO and the illegal toxic dumping. So they were so damn scared, they didn't give a damn about what was legal or illegal. They confiscated all the records, all the files, all the Lufon material, took it away. It has been an uphill battle to ever try and get that stuff returned because it's not their property in the first place. And then they, since this carried over through the night into the early morning hours, news had reached News 12 Long Island, and they already had this whole package deal put together for the marketing scheme. And that morning, they show him and his associates being hauled out of the house in handcuffs, and his neighbors are looking at him like, what the hell's going on? You know, he's one of our favorite neighbors. We've never had any problems with him. And there's News 12. I mean, they made him look like he was a degenerate, a derelict. They took him out of his own house in handcuffs. And the whole damn portrayal by News 12 Long Island specifically, as well as the newspapers, Newsday, Daily News, Washington Post, none of them are innocent. They all got in on this because it was a cheap thrill for fan ratings and readership to make this guy look like he was a UFO nutjob and a terrorist. And then in front of News 12 Long Island, they start hauling out boxes of his guns right in front of him, as if somehow that was supposed to make him look like this threat to the neighborhood, this threat to the community. Oh, here's the psychopath who believes in UFOs, and he's got this whole gun collection. He's going to take over Suffolk County. He's going to kill the politicians. And they take him away and lock him up. Well, luckily enough, he was retired from Suffolk County judicial system. He worked for many years as a court officer. This is where it also gets more asinine. How crazy could this guy be when he was on Suffolk County's payroll as a respected court officer in the court of law, carrying a gun and handcuffs himself as a police officer in a courtroom? Luckily enough, his associates that he had worked with as court officers were still working in the judicial system. They found out that he was being brought in on these trumped-up charges. And people like John Marafino and Joel Shapiro, who are friends of his from his days of working as a court officer, they were still there as court officers. They went to John Ford in his cell, and they stood there and they took care of him because they knew what was going down. And they were afraid that someone was going to try and poison him, assassinate him, kill him off somehow. So John Marafino and Joel Shapiro were the only two reasons why John Ford was allowed to live past his jail cell, okay? Because they watched him like a hawk and made damn sure that nobody else came near him that wasn't allowed to. And which is phenomenal in this story, that sense of friendship and loyalty that kept him alive. Because without those two still being court officers, John Ford would be dead right now. And he would have died in the first 6 months, okay, because somebody would have gotten to him. And then he was brought before the court system. And once again, John Marafino and Joel Shapiro were the only two that brought him food and water so that they knew it wasn't poisoned, okay? And they were the ones that had to watch him go into the courtroom before this idiot judge and this reject that he had as a court-appointed attorney who was himself a lackey for the system itself. And he was given a choice at that point, and this was where the whole damn legal point of contention goes to hell, because at that split decision point, John, who was already in a drugged-up stupor, because somehow they drug him, I guess in terms of trying to get him to confess to something he didn't do, and this was prior to a point in time when John Marafio and Joel Shapiro could watch him. He goes into the court of law, still in somewhat of a drunken stupor from the drugs they pumped into him. And at that point, a difficult decision had to be made. Do you plead innocent and go to trial and run the risk of losing the trial and therefore losing your pension? Okay, or your 401k, in his case it was his pension. Do you run the risk of losing that? Or do you plead insanity and get to keep your pension, okay, and not have to go to trial, but then be locked up in a padded room for God knows how many years, okay? That's the decision that was made at that point in 1996 when all of this went down. And unfortunately, in the state of affairs that things were in, his lawyer told him, you're better off pleading insanity. Don't take this to trial. And, of course, it didn't help that they had already interrogated Joe Mazzucchelli in this whole mess, and he came out scared lily-white, okay, and went to John and said, John, we have no way to win this. We're screwed. And Joe Mazzucchelli did time in jail and was out, 6 to 8 months later. Why? Why the hell was he allowed to go 6 to 8 months later? And why is John Ford still sitting in a sanitarium 20 years later? But the motivating factors were everybody was telling John, you can't win this, plead insanity. And of course, John's thinking was the only way I can keep my pension is to plead insanity. So all this bad advice was now being rammed down his throat when he was in a questionable, drugged-up state of mind, and was very impressionable at that point. And at that point, he agreed to it. He says, I'll take the insanity plea and go that route and try and come back from that. Well, at that point, they went and locked his ass away in this heinous and disgusting institution that is infamous for making back alley deals with Suffolk County by keeping people locked up. And that is known as the Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center, Forensic Center, Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Forensic Center. And this place has psychotic criminals in there. I mean, they have people in there who really should be in there, don't get me wrong, okay? People who, don't exactly mingle with the population. But to put someone, a community leader who is absolutely genteel, into that environment was absolutely disgusting. And this is what John Ford has been surrounded by for the last 20 years now in the Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Forensic Center. He's been surrounded by these nut jobs and psychoholic freak shows with, and the whole damn thing is bad legal representation, because after his first lawyer bowed out, that lawyer, his name is John something, his last name escapes me, ended up being promoted to head superintendent of highways for Suffolk County. Gee, I wonder how that happened. And then he was promoted to having his own judgeship with Suffolk County. Gee, I wonder how that happened too, This is the total asinine nature of how the corruption is hiding in plain sight. And what's funny is he's still alive. All the other key players are dead. Like I said, James Catterson, this guy in 1996, even I knew the way News 12 was promoting this was bullshit. And I mean, there was just no way, because when this all went down in 1996 and it was plastered all across News 12 Long Island, I called up Peter Moon. I was like, Peter, what the hell happened? What is this? And Peter started explaining the details to me. I was like, oh my God. And at that point, it looked pretty grim, as you know, because they had all the evidence in their favor, but nobody wanted to listen. News 12 went to bed with Suffolk County. Suffolk County went to bed with D.A. Catterson. And D.A. Catterson got out in front of News 12 and presented this whole portrayal of a psychotic UFO nutjob. And, oh, look, here's 2 tables worth of guns. He must be out of his goddamn mind, because look at his gun collection. You know? And they had that right on News 12 Long Island. And, of course, then they're talking about radium. And what reject on Long Island is going to know the difference between radium and plutonium? You throw the word radium at somebody, and all of a sudden it's like a deer caught in the headlights. Oh, my God, radioactive material. What was he going to do with that? And he's got all these guns, and, you know, the imagination runs wild for the ignorant, the stupid, and the uneducated. Okay? And in the court of public opinion, this is how they sold that package deal, sold him down the drain, and made it next to impossible for him to feel like he could have a fair court trial and win, which to this day I still feel he could have if he had the lawyer that he had now, Robert Reno. Okay, in between, after the first lawyer sold him down the river, the second lawyer was Andrea Rizzoli. He had her for about, get this, about 6 or 7 years. She represented him. She got nowhere. She did nothing. Finally, he was convinced to get rid of her, and in place of her, over the past year now, he's been represented by this new lawyer, Robert Reno, who seems to, even though he's got a busy schedule and is next to impossible to get a hold of, he seems to have his act together with a lot more experience, because one of the things that Robert Reno knows is the bullshit that goes on with the psychiatric community in New York State and how it relates to Suffolk County. Specifically, he knows how Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center, you know, wheels and deals. And so he already had a good idea of how things went down with John Ford before he even looked at the case. So he's officially taken it on as his representative now.
It's got all the trappings of a Kafkaesque psychodrama where, you know, you look at somebody like John Ford. Clearly, to me, a psych profile was done on John. They knew he had a soft touch for homeless people, for transient people, for down and outers, right?
Yes.
And that's how they infiltrated that guy in, and everything unraveled from there. So it's Kafkaesque, but it's something that people have to understand is real time. John Ford is still basically rotting away as a political prisoner in Suffolk County. So we've reached the end of the first hour. We were just getting started. We've been listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, our very special guest is Richard Smith, who's been going into painstaking detail about what's happened to John Ford. What's happened to John Ford, folks, is something that could happen to anyone, right? There's a lot of people out there in fear for their lives because their constitutional rights are being usurped. Well, people like John Ford have been in the trenches fighting for your freedom, your right to know about things like UFOs crashing into public parks. Because of his diligent efforts, the whole system has swarmed on him. It's turned into a feeding frenzy. So we've reached the end of the first hour. We'll get back to you at the top of the next hour.